I'm Vijay Solanki, and today I get this very exciting and slightly amusing opportunity to turn the tables. And I'm joined by Tim Burrowes, which anyone who's any part of the Australian, New Zealand media and marketing scene will know well. The purpose of this conversation is to talk to Tim and ask him questions about his journey as a news media startup founder. Hello, Tim. How are you?
Hey, Vijay. I'm very well, thank you very much. And it does seem a bit ironic that we're both actually in the same city for once, and yet here we are doing things virtually.
I know, but and this way we get to easily capture this conversation and share it amongst a group of founders who I think will be eager to hear to what you've got to say. So let's take you back. I remember, and we've talked about this once or twice, you've got, like me, British roots, and I remember that you were a journalist for Media Week, but it would be fantastic if you could just spend a minute or two on your backstory, how you got into journalism, what you've done, and what triggered you to start Mumbrella, how it came about.
Yeah, sure. So I've been a journalist for my whole career since I was 18. So I started back in 1989. So I'm one of the few still working journalists who trained on typewriters, I suspect. My first few years of my career was as a print journalist on local newspapers. That sort of good old traditional broadsheet weeklies, then on to sort of multi-edition dailies. And then I guess the first sort of twist in my career was to move into kind of business publishing. Initially, that sort of world of B2B was actually on a magazine called Hospital Doctor, which was a weekly magazine, which was, about the politics of the NHS in the UK. So I was actually there for about 6 years, eventually became the editor. And that was probably the first sort of, I guess, big and not non-automatic career move I made, where I went from editing Hospital Doctor to editing Media Week magazine. And I think when someone is hiring an editor, they have two choices, really. They either hire somebody who already knows the beat very well, but hasn't necessarily got the editing skills, or they do the opposite. And I was lucky enough that they took the risk on me having the editing skills, and that I would then build up the beat knowledge, which honestly, it coming into covering the media and the sort of media and marketing world, it probably takes a good year before you even realise how little that you actually know.
And was that a deliberate move or an opportunistic move into media?
I had been absolutely fascinated by media, so that whole time that I was on Hospital Doctor, my homepage was set to Media Guardian, so it was my own world. I think maybe in the same way that when I was on local newspapers, it was my own world. So look, just always incredibly interested by that world, because you're writing for your peers, which has its pluses and minuses, but about a fascinating world to me anyway. So I did a couple of years or so on Media Week, and the Media Week in the UK was very much focused on the sort of the connection point between media agencies and media sales. So it's all about the business, and really focused on the business of media. And then after a couple of years of doing that, I was asked to be the launch editor of Campaign magazine in Dubai, which covered the whole of the Middle East. So that was my introduction to, as well as writing about media, writing about the marketing world and the creative agency side of the world. And then by then I'd always decided I'd be away from the UK for a year or two. So it was about time to go back to the UK. And I think I've been back in the UK for about 2 or 3 weeks when I had the offer to come and be the editor of B&T magazine, which at the time was still a print product. It was weekly. It was still a long time since it had been known as broadcasting and television. which is where the B&T
Holy
came
cow, I
from.
didn't even know. That makes so much
Yeah,
sense. I've never
no, it
asked
took
the
me a
question.
long. It took me a
Right.
long time to work it out as well. And of course, it dates back to the days when people thought that broadcasting and television were two different things. And that was my entree into the Australian scene. Did that for exactly 2 years to the day, in fact, because that's what I promised I'd do. And then after that, had the opportunity to be part of the team that launched Mumbrella and was the first employee.
So where did the idea for Mumbrella come about?
In part, it was a natural evolution of everything I'd always done in trade press publishing, but online. And by then I'd become really interested in certainly the blogging side of things, which I'd started a blog when I was on Campaign Middle East, so that was it was nowhere near the first, but it was relatively early, so that would have been about 2004 or something. So that was a world I was becoming kind of increasingly interested in. So the initial thought was that maybe what we would do is we would super serve individual audiences within that kind of wider media and marketing world. So, we had the terrible idea of doing a series of weekly PDF newsletters, one for media agencies, one for maybe people working in creative agencies, one for marketers and so on. The blogging side of Mumbrella, and it was just a WordPress blog initially, that was the bit that really took off. So we never actually did the terrible PDFs idea.
Right, but that was the plan. And what you're saying, you didn't go into production with the PDFs.
The thought was, because we launched in it was actually early December by the time we launched, so there didn't seem much point launching newsletters at that point of the year. So this was December the 9th, 2008. We kind of thought, okay, well, we'll probably launch in February. And by then it was taking off like a rocket ship. We were getting so much interaction, so many comments. Again, it was as Twitter was coming through and there was a lot of sharing going on. So it really felt that we'd found a formula that was working. That the immediacy was really exciting for me. It felt almost because you were publishing so many articles each day and getting so much immediate feedback. That felt like the where we'd found a moment. So that we there was.
So in that sense, was it successful? Or certainly the blog was successful from the get-go, from day one.
In finding an audience, yes. In commercializing it, no. We really struggled to commercialize it initially. So we, after a while, we, began to do a few small events, and they would find a sponsor, and we'd sell a few tickets. So these would be like a breakfast event with a panel of 4, and they were great for community building. But one of the problems we had breaking into an established trade press set was everybody else was still selling print advertising. And it was actually, back then, I mean, it sounds ridiculous now, it was actually quite a pain creating digital ads, particularly for one new product. So that was actually one of the barriers, as we were quite soon into the market. So that was one thing. And then another thing was just the market dynamic was a lot of the kind of people whose heartland was print, and that included B&T, where I'd worked, and been something I'd found frustrating. They would tend to give away the digital advertising, just sort of so long as someone took an ad in the magazine, So yeah, it was quite different times to today, I suppose.
Yeah. No, it's kind of reminiscent of many traditional media companies, not going back that many years. It was analog dollars and digital dimes, I think, if you remember. What gave you the confidence to launch with digital back in 2008?
I think about it now, and I think I was probably a little naive, actually, and a little foolish, because I was on a good wicket. I was being quite well paid at B&T. So I suppose the one thing was I joined a couple of business partners who were already in the publishing game. They specialised in the travel trade press. So one of them was an owner of TNT magazine, but then as a sort of sister company, they had this thing already an off-the-shelf company called Focal Attractions, which was publishing something called Backpacker Trade News, which was trade news for the adventure and backpack industry, and they were running an awards, and it was making a little bit of money. So when I joined, I joined as a shareholder in that company. So I suppose the fact that I was joining something which was already mildly profitable probably de-risked it a little bit for me. Although I look back now and I realise it was probably riskier than I realised at the time.
So who were your co-founders?
So my co-founders were Martin Lane, who I had first very briefly crossed paths with in the UK, actually. He'd been a fellow editor of Travel Weekly at Read Business Information at the same time that I'd edited Hospital Doctor. And although we maybe sat next to each other on a couple of courses, we didn't really know each other. Martin had then ended up in Australia as publisher of B&T. So it was actually through somebody we knew in common that Martin sort of hired me into Australia to come over to B&T, and then he promptly left to go over to work on TNT magazine until we got together again a couple of years later. And then the other person was Ian Wakeling, who had been the general manager of TNT magazine, and when the owners, which was kind of indirectly the Guardian, when they pulled out of Australia that time round, he was sort of left holding the baby, so ended up the publisher of TNT.
Got it. And how was it then? So you co-founded this with two people you'd never really worked with?
Yeah, you're right. I hadn't actually worked together with either one of them for any significant amount of time because Martin had left B&T not long after I joined. But we stayed in touch. So yeah. Look, I everything I know now about co-founder dynamics is the advice is try and know quite well the person you're going to co-found with. And I think that's probably good advice.